And welcome to this hour on Primetime America. I'm Greg Wheatley. Well, without a doubt, at the center of the Christian faith is the cross. We all know that. It is the cross where God accomplished his great redemptive purpose for us, sending his Son to give his very life in atonement for us. Because of that, the cross has also been a highly valued symbol through the years. And just about every Christian of every denominational stripe or of every persuasion has known the symbol of the cross. The mystery of the cross, bringing ancient Christian images to life, is the name of a book by Judith Couchman, and it takes a look at this amazing cross down through the years, particularly in visual imagery. Judith Couchman is an author, obviously. She also teaches art history courses at the University of Colorado. This book, The Mystery of the Cross, is published by InterVarsity. Judith, welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me.
What an interesting topic. How long has this been of interest to you?
Well, for several years. I can tell you how I got interested. I've worked as an author for many years, but at midlife I started taking some art history courses just because I love it. And when I got into medieval art, I started seeing so many images of the cross and stories about the cross and just God at work through artwork that I had never seen before, or I'd never heard any of the stories before. And I got very intrigued because my Christian tradition didn't teach a lot of these symbols and signs and stories. And so the more I studied, the more I thought, I bet there's a lot of people out there, especially Protestants, that haven't heard these. And they brought so much meaning and enrichment to my own life. I thought, well, okay, here's another book.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, you kind of alluded to this, but in some ways there's been sort of a distrust of symbols, hasn't there, among Protestants? And we could talk about, reasons for that and so forth. But because of that, we probably have shied away from talking about the images.
Yeah, I think so. I think the Reformation is still with us, and there were many good things accomplished during that time, of course. But I think that some traditions have begun, you're right, have shied away and been afraid of making a symbol into an idol or something appropriate, putting their trust in the symbol instead of Christ.
Right.
And so I thought, I grew up in that tradition. My readers know me that way, so perhaps I can bring these images back to us and we can appreciate them for what they represent, for what they mean, not lauding the images and making them, the sacred thing, but using them as a way to bring us to the cross. So what I did is I chose 40 images of the cross from from pre-Christian times, actually, up through about the year 1000. And talked about those images, talked about the stories behind the images, wrote about how early Christians honored the cross in worship and in life, and then kind of bring that home to us and what can we learn from these early Christians? How does it apply to our lives? So it's a mixture of a little bit of art history, a little bit of church history, and also just spiritual transformation. How can it affect us?
That's a great idea. Let me take you back to this. One of the things that I think is most fascinating is pre-Christian images of the cross. I mean, we almost think by definition that wouldn't even exist.
Right, and that's exactly where I was when I started studying all this. I never thought of the cross before Christ's crucifixion, really. I hadn't even explored much about how the cross was used, as a Roman torture device. But if you go back in time, you see images of the cross in other religions or just in places where people have no explanation for why it's there. One example, and I devote a chapter to this, are the standing stones of Callanish that are in Scotland. And they're these huge, what they call monolith stones, standing upright, but when you view it from above, it makes the sign of a cross, and nobody knows really why it's there. And some people will say, well, because we saw the cross in other places, that Christianity isn't real. It just borrowed a pagan religion and borrowed the sign of the cross and made up its own religion. But I kind of like turning that on its ear and saying, God took a sign, a very simple sign that was already in the universe, and redeemed it for himself. And so even thousands of years before Christ came and sacrificed for us, the cross existed. And I think, were they like little prophecies that Christ was coming?
Little lights shining in the darkness, sort of.
Yeah, right, before he even came. And I was really intrigued by that idea. And so instead of saying, well, it doesn't, make any sense, or we stole something, it's like God used what we recognized in the universe and what was being used as a torture device in one of the worst ways possible to die. He took that sign and redeemed it.
Yeah.
And it becomes a message of hope and comfort and eternal life to us.
And of course,
that's pretty exciting.
It is. And of course, taken as a visual design itself, it's very simple, isn't it? I mean, the cross it doesn't get much more simple.
Yeah, and there have even been times with archaeologists that they'll think they have, they see something that's a cross, and they'll think that, Christians were here, for example, in Pompeii, but they find out later that it was such a simple sign that it was used for something else. So sometimes it wasn't always a religious sign. But I just think it's intriguing to see how God uses what exists in the world to bring people to Him.
You teach art and art history, so I know that this is a question you've pondered. You probably expect your students to give it back on a test, I would guess. When are the first times that we see the cross after Christ? Now, when does it first become depicted in painting or stylized or in sculpture? What are we dealing with there?
Well, it's different than we think because now we can only go by the evidence we find. So as far as art historians are concerned, they say that for 200 years after Christ's crucifixion, there really wasn't any Christian art, and they have a lot, and not even signs of the cross. They have a lot of different reasons for that we can't go into here. But one of the earliest signs that they found was actually graffiti found in Rome. And there's a picture of, it's a cross, and there's a man on the cross, but the man has a donkey's head.
Right.
And,
yes, I've seen that. Yeah.
And they can't. There's differing opinions as to whether that is someone expressing their faith or someone mocking the faith. But that's one of the earliest signs. And then after that, there are signs of the cross showing up. And then some of the earliest signs of the crucifixion weren't until about the 4th century. So it took a while.
Yeah.
And I think some of that is, there's a lot of different reasons, but some of that might be that it was such a horrific and sacred sign that people weren't using it for a long time.
Judith Couchman is with us this afternoon. A fascinating topic about the cross. The book is called The Mystery of the Cross, Bringing Ancient Christian Images to Life. And we'll be back. We're going to take a break here and be back in just a moment and talk further with Judith Couchman. The Mystery of the Cross, Bringing Ancient Christian Images to Life, the title of the book by Judith Couchman. It's published by InterVarsity, and of course we'll link you to more information when you visit primetimeamerica.org. Judith, I'm curious to know, as an art professor and one who follows, I'm sure, who studies art not just that contain the cross, but all kinds, some of your favorite paintings that depict the cross, what comes to mind?
Oh, wow. There's quite a
That's a tough question to throw at you, isn't it?
Yeah, that is a tough question. Sorry. I am really drawn to one that is very simple and it's very childlike. It looks like some of the earliest pictures look like maybe a child actually drew it. But there's a painting called The Descent from the Cross. And there's many variations on it. It started probably during what we call the Byzantine period, probably around the 6th, 7th, 8th century, around there. But it shows two men, one of them, Joseph of Arimathea, taking Christ down from the cross. And I guess in my own Protestant upbringing, I'd seen a lot of crucifixions, a lot of plain crosses or whatever, or while Jesus was suffering on the cross. But this was after the crucifixion, and they are lovingly taking down Christ's body. And there's been many versions of that painted through the centuries. But I hadn't given much thought to what happened after Christ died and that time between the death and getting him to the tomb. I always kind of just jump from the crucifixion to the resurrection. Let's get on to the good part.
Yep.
And it was such a loving, caring reminder, and also made me think about there actually was a body. And this kind of course, when I was working on this book, my mother was very ill and died. So it was very poignant to me because I was with my mother after she died. And just the sacredness of that moment. And I had never thought of the sacredness and the caring of Christ's friends for his body, going through the ritual preparation. So I don't mean to make that sound morbid, but what I wanted to bring out in the book is that this was an equally holy time, and that there are art images that depict this.
Reminds us that God cares about the material. I mean, that whole error that sprang up that we know as the Gnostic error that tried to deny the reality or the goodness of the physical. That's not God's idea, is it?
No, not at all. And I think also it was that whole time was just a matter of respect for their friend and lingering with him and wanting to still be in his physical presence. These are people that had touched him when he was alive, and I think in a way it was like hanging on a little bit longer until they had to let go of him. And I don't know, I just found that really touching and significant, and also something to think about as we, our next holiday is Easter, and I think it's something to think of during the Lenten season, or that Good Friday weekend.
Where do we get the development of people signing the sign of the cross as some kind of signal or a devotional tool? I'm not sure of the history of that.
Well, that happens really early on in Christianity. And one thing, when you study a book like this, you have to constantly say, I'm not sure if this story is true, because so much has been handed down extra-biblically, oral stories that I'm not always sure what's true and what's not. But some people say as early as, as Christ did it, or his first disciples, but it was definitely there in the earliest church. You can find little snippets of things that early church fathers said in the in the 4th century, and they used the sign of the cross for a lot of different things. To bless people, to keep them from evil. But again, it wasn't the sign that does it. The sign was pointing to the power of the cross, to do that. And I think that's probably what got mixed up in, in church history, that people, started depending on the sign instead of on Christ.
Which is always a temptation or a possibility, isn't it?
Absolutely, because, that's a physical something we can see.
Right.
That helps us to get to the spiritual.
We've just got a minute and a half, Judith.
Okay.
Let's pretend that all of us had the privilege of enrolling in your art class here for a minute. Just give us a little whirlwind idea of some things to look for. I mean, if we were going to go down to the Art Institute and wanted to look for images of the cross, just a couple of ideas.
Well, I would think, first of all, look for it and see how it's being used and who is using it. One thing you have to realize that for a while in Christianity that art became the state religion, and so sometimes it was just used as a matter of power. Yep. But look for those times when they think the painting is indicating that this is a matter of personal faith. And where is it appearing? Is the person making a sign? Are they carrying a cross? Is there a cross on their clothing? All of those meant different things. But the thing we need to remember in early Christianity, the origin was sacred and deeply